Dear colleagues and dear teacher, welcome to my presentation on contemporary social movements. The topic that I chose is the national trans rights movement in the USA, and I am going to present in here a brief history of the US's trans rights movement. I'm going to do a comparison between two countries. I'm going to offer my critique and positionality on the movement and advance an educational theory that could help for advocating for the trans rights movement. Let's begin with the brief history of the USA's trans rights movement. We find a mainstream history of the trans rights movement. That is that in 1969, the Stonewall riots became the birth of the LGBT movement. Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson founded STAR, that is the Straight Transvestites Action Revolutionaries, and then that various movements from there have existed throughout the end of the 20th century and fragmented into different LGBT communities. Although this is just a surface, the history of the trans movements in the US does go back to about the 1850s and the 1950s, where we have testimonies of actual successful lives lived across genders and sexes. Moreover, Hirschfeld, who was a Jewish gay medical doctor, was the first advocate for trans identities because he started to depathologize the matter of gender identity. And just later, Richter, who was a follower of Hirschfeld, did the first documented case of male to female sex change by surgical operation. Between 1985 and 1955, there were gay and trans movements in the US. And so these were movements before STAR. As well, the Stonewall riots were not definitely the first. More famous, it is the most famous, but other riots happened in 1959, for example, at the Cooper Donuts retailer in LA and Compton's Cafeteria in San Francisco in 1966. So we can see how Stonewall riots and the birth of STAR is an anecdotal beginning of the US trans movement, but upon research, we can find more. What are the social and political contexts of the birth of these rights, these trans rights movements? Well, as we said, the pathologization and the criminalization of the trans identities were the first and only way that trans identities were publicly mentioned. Moreover, public violence and assault to the member of the community, especially if their identity intersected with like migrants or black people or women. And then the difficulties in the inclusion of the growing male-dominated national gay movement. Even the lesbians had the lesbian movements had difficulties catching up with actually the male-dominated white gay movement. More key figures for the trans rights movement. So Marissa Sherry Lynn, founder of the FIGE, Ollie Boswell, who was an author and came up with the word transgender to identify more identities. Phyllis Fry, a judge from Texas, Gender PAC was one of her lobbies for the inclusion of the legislative agenda of the Congress. Mara Kisling, founder of the National Center for Trans Equality, that now is called Advocates for Trans Equality, and Judith Butler, one of the most important philosophers of the gender studies, contemporary gender studies that critically analyze the relationship between sex, gender, and the culture that perpetrates them. The global considerations and the global impact of these movements has to do with the fact that the USA has a mainstream power and has a leadership role, but leadership did not always translate into support, as the word transgender and other English words such as queer do eclipse local varieties of non-conforming gender identities. I am mentioning in here Honapes, Tomboy, Marimaches from Japan, Mexico, and Thailand, for example. Let's begin with the comparative analysis of two more trans right movements and the intertextuality that depends on the context that they are about. So South Korea, what's the history of it? The trans right movement has it's generally divided in three phases, 1, 2, and 3. One starts at the beginning of the 19th with Chodong Hoe, that was established as a gay movement. There was no actual trans mention of it, although trans people were included in this particular movement. From 1998 to 2008, internet communities started to grow, and favorable governments allowed the movement to advance some requests. Moreover, in the cultural scene, celebrities started to come out as gay or trans. Phase 3, despite internal divisions in the LGBTQ movement, at the moment the movement is united. It unites gay, lesbian, and transsexual, and intersex, and asexual, etc., with under the umbrella of queer. Therefore, we can see how in this phase 3, South Korea accepts the lesson of the US and embraces the words the US is using. The intertextuality can be traced back to Confucianism. Confucianism, well, the individual's identities were indeed depending on their role and on the expectations of family and parents and gender norms, etc. So during phase 1, same-sex relationships were seen as a disruption, as a protest, as a social protest against the traditional order of patriarchy and heterosexuality that we have seen comes from Confucianism. In the early 2000s, as we mentioned, with the cultural explosion of trans and gay rights, Suk Chong-hon and Ri Soo-ha came out as gay men and transgender women respectively, although we see that the media representation tries to kind of hijack their narrative and actually represent the stereotypes by just making the public curious, not really interrogating on this type of identity. In the popular representations, outing is never a prerogative for queer folks themselves. So what happens is that in media representation, a gay or trans is always outed by someone else, and there is usually an identity between tragic characters and the reveal of their identity as being non-conformative. In fact, that secret that they have is usually linked with other schemes in the media representation. There is not a common or accepted distinction between gender and sex in South Korean culture, denying the conforming identities. And there is also a lot of gender dysphoria diagnosis, so mental and physical disabilities, as testified by the case of Hee Soo-byun, who was a military who transitioned from male to female and got excluded from the military, therefore causing her to actually commit suicide after the refusal. In Italy, instead, we find a very different situation. So, first of all, public protests for trans rights already had started at the beginning of the 70s and at the end of the 60s with the case of La Romanina and the foundation of Fuori. La Romanina was a transgender woman who had her sex change in Geneva, Switzerland, but when came back to Italy, got arrested, to house arrests for public indecency, because at the end of the 60s, that was still the case, that such laws existed. Fuori is a gay movement, but the founder, Mieli, is actually non-binary. MIT is the Movimento Italiano Transessuali, born in Bologna, as the first and only trans-only movement to advocate for legally recognized exchange and sexual harassment policies and against hate crime and DEI policies as well. It is supported by Fuori. They will obtain some recognition, but we will see that in detail in a moment. During the 80s and the 90s, the advocacy was done through grassroots community-based association. MIT is to date the largest national trans rights movement, and it's the only one actually that holds that title. What's the intertextuality here in Italy? Well, in Italy there were mentions of non-conforming gender identities. For example, transgender, gay men, intersex, asexual, they were all called femminili in the area of Naples. So there was this type of erasure of particular identities and nicknaming with just one encompassing term. Transgender experience are framed as a medical and psychological issue. Even in the law that in 1982 was passed through the advocacy of MIT and Fuori. It has to be noted that the first mobilizations at the end of the 60s were, in fact, a consequence of the Stonewall riots. So knowing about those did kick the creation of the transgender rights movement in Italy. Representation in the media of trans identity is largely negative, and it has a negative impact on individuals. And there is not really a national history of trans rights movements, nor of trans identities that is organic and constructed. So what are the implications? With this comparative analysis, we have discovered that the intertextuality in places like South Korea and Italian, which are religious and conservative, does reinforce the marginalization and prevents the recognition of actual identities that exist, but instead they are erased. The institution perpetrates the exclusion of trans folk and exacerbates the inequalities. Of course, that also comes for the fact that the laws do always mention gender dysphoria or other pathological issues. Also, we have understood that the US's narrative and language has been pushing, but also monopolizing the local specificity. Now, there is the second part with the critique positionality, but let's see what are the pros and cons. Well, the first pros is that the US's national movement for trans rights did provide some legal milestones. Sometimes they are the first. So there are laws for changes in ID, anti-discrimination laws for sexual harassment, DEI, hiring, etc. The visibility of the US's trans rights movements is indeed something of global importance, and the global influence does make sure that every national trans group can identify themselves into some agreed upon language. And of course, the frameworks for right advocacy is something that other movements have taken from the national movements in the US. The cons are, of course, in my opinion, the fragmentation. There is always this exclusion of the trans rights movement from the other LGBTQ movements. Therefore, we can see that that is a weakness, a challenge. Similarly, the trans movement is not identified with other intersectional identity groups, most notably sex worker and migrants. The global monopoly, as we said, has positive and negative effect. The negative one is that, unfortunately, the influences of the monopoly of this, of the US's culture, still faces the problem of erasing some local identities. The implications and the recommendation for this movement is that the marginalization, we have understood that the marginalization is created by cultural norms and reinforced by institution. We see that there are always in the laws a blurry distinction between what sex and gender is, and that of course this causes a limited access to equitable healthcare and, of course, to other legal recognitions. There are no educational systems that have critical literacy aimed at advocacy for these type of groups. And, of course, we see that the global homogenization of queer identities has these negative and positive aspects that we need to consider. The recommendation is to adapt the legal frameworks to reflect gender self-affirmation, personal histories and identities, and not just the medicalization of the issues. A more research on what are the intersectionalities for a more effective advocacy, and of course a inclusion of critical literacy in curricula to decentralize narratives and amplify all the minorities and their voices, of course even within the trans community. So, as mentioned, my position is one of advocate for queer and trans folk. I advocate for the dismantling of current perception of vulnerable groups. I advocate for changing the law that regulates their freedoms and to create policies for social inclusion and, of course, education, equitable education. To foster alternative narratives. My own intersectionality is one of actually relative privilege because I am white, male, and straight. But I have more identities within me. I am a migrant at the moment. I am a student. I'm an atheist, and I have this set of values that do define me. In Italy, I do also have the status of the identity of internal immigrant, so Southern Italians, that's my family origin, Southern Italians who relocate north for work prospect. At the moment, I am a migrant, and I have been a migrant for quite a few years right now, and so I have experienced injustice related to the bias towards my nationality. As soon as I could promote my values in pedagogical settings, I have found that the advocacy for vulnerable groups is a great way to promote social change and to promote the creation of an alternative narrative, especially historical narrative, to challenge assumptions. I would like to take a minute right now to show this slide, which is a reflection prompt. By scanning the QR code, you are directed to a Microsoft form that contains 4 questions, and at the end of your personal reflection, we will reconvene in the room and be able to respond to the 2 questions on the slide. What is our role in perpetrating a harmful narrative? And what do we do to disrupt it? Let's continue with the final part, which is the educational approach to advocate for the trans rights. I wish to propose the theoretical framework of the critical archival studies. What are the principles and objectives of such approach? Well, archives are fundamental for any group's self-identification and historicization. The archival practices are not neutral and do reflect power structure. So critical archival studies do seek to alter practices related to archival and collective memory, not only for the preservation, but also for the creation. What is the rationale to use this type of framework for our educational purposes, where trans rights history depends on the intertextuality of gender identity in the US, and we also see that the collection of trans experience has been useful to rediscover voices that were silenced, even within the movement itself. At the moment, students are creating the content that will be populating the future digital archives. And not only is the right to consult, but also to create all the narratives that interest them, especially if their identities are marginalized, disenfranchised by social institutional justice. This type of educational approach has to be rooted in critical pedagogy, critical race theory, and other critical literacy studies to focus on uncovering, preserving, and building upon marginalized narratives and the voices that the dominant narratives erase. What could be the tenets for this theory? Well, democratization of knowledge, uncovering the historical erasures, the participatory co-creation of new content, and the translation to education through critical literacy. Finally, I wish to reflect on on this work, what I have learned, and what I will bring with myself after this. This is how I worked. Well, this is how the research went, and of course, there is also an AI disclaimer for the use that I have done of AI tools such as ChatGPT and others. This is what I learned. I deepened my understanding of a movement. I understood how a critical approach to education, law, and medicine does help advocating for marginalized folk. I strengthened my critical literacy and transformative learning principles for my research and my profession. And of course, I reflected on my positionality and my intersectionalities just to understand how I am positioned in front of these movements and their rights and requests. I thank you very much for your attention. I hope that this was a learning experience for you as much as it was for me. Here is a last page with all the references that have helped me with this work. And I wish you a lovely rest of your day. Bye-bye.